that we've been at this. And so right now, we're going to get right into Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74, this week in Bitcoin. Okay, so let's run through the news that happened this week in Bitcoin. Right. The bit that I think slipped through people's minds is that there was a big announcement and everyone was focused on whether Trump and his family had invested in Binance US, which is the non-news. What the real news is that Binance actually had the largest investment ever in crypto by Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi has a sovereign wealth fund called MGX, and it pledged $2 billion to Binance. Now, the reason this is significant is for several reasons. If you remember in the past, we covered in previous blogs, you can check them out on simondixon.com or on my YouTube channel, or get yourself a free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal where you can go through all the archives. But one of them, we covered the whole Binance US hostile takeover. And that was where Binance essentially had a bit of a controlled demolition by the US government. It's got 260 million users. And they fined Binance $4.7 billion. They did a negotiation with CZ that he only gets 4 months in prison, which he has served now. He has to step down as CEO, and they implanted their own compliance department. And then I went through exactly how they weaponized that in order to shut down accounts as part of the geopolitical warfare when they were firing financial weapons of mass destruction. Well, that was where it was. So if you go through, and I was at the Chengdu conference when CZ left OKX, the exchange, one of the largest exchanges in China, and then he was, pitching and did in a couple of weeks the launch of the BNB token and Binance the exchange. And shortly after, he was pretty much chased out of China. He went to Japan, where he was chased out of Japan. And then in America, they decided to do this controlled demolition. So on the big, economies, China, Japan, and US, and including UK and various other jurisdictions, they all, really came after Binance. Now, this created a strategic opportunity for the jurisdiction that has been adjusting, UAE, to getting a regulatory environment up together, doing Bitcoin mining IPOs, and really collaborating itself for the industry and understanding the Bitcoin proof of work is, in fact, one of the most geopolitically strategic and important energy plays in the market. Now, it requires a bit of understanding to get there, especially from sovereign nations, but Abu Dhabi are definitely there. And so what Abu Dhabi is doing is, because it is pretty much the center of the world, it sits between, the capital markets of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the Hang Seng, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and then the large Western markets like in Europe, the DAX, the CAC, the London Stock Exchange, and of course, the king of all capital markets at the moment, which is going through a serious recollaboration that we will be discussing in the macro section, which is, of course, the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. It is looking, I believe, to implement, and this is a multi-year play from my speculation, to actually turn Binance and its strategic investment into a leapfrogging capital markets. Now, throughout my career and at Bank to the Future, we have very much been involved in investing in companies that are looking to use our industry in order to recollaborate financial markets and capital markets, whether it be in 2014, we launched the first ever Bitcoin bond. And we also invested in companies like Securitize, which were creating, ways of doing share transfers on a blockchain and being a transfer agent, various other things. And we've invested in various security tokens over its time. But there was always a few problems. One, it didn't have the regulatory environment So we created several broker dealers, and then there was hostile environments in the US. But it never quite had the regulatory structure. And then when it did have the regulatory structure, it took away so much liquidity that it ended up being a low liquid, inferior product. Well, when you take a tax haven, a tax neutral environment in the center of the world, and you combine that with a 260 million database, and that database is pretty much crypto native. So these are people that have been used to being expelled from the banking system, having to do peer-to-peer fiat currency rails, which Binance built. And also, when they did the controlled demolition, they wiped out its stablecoin, but it had traction in the stablecoin. But now we're moving to an environment where you're putting, treasuries on blockchains to create these tokenized real-world assets, and then it will be securities and all these things. But to be able to do that, I believe that this is a play to make a strategic investment. What are sovereign wealth funds? Well, they only invest strategically when it is a strategic play for the country. So I believe that they would like to leapfrog capital markets. And of course, if this can be done natively on chain, where you can take securities off exchanges and over to other exchanges, rather than people saying I have to list on the New York Stock Exchange and then I dual list on the Tokyo Stock Exchange, but you can't take your securities cross markets, I think this could be a leapfrogging of capital markets. Now, if you combine them through stablecoins, Bitcoin, we're getting more and more traction. Now, stablecoins are being built on top of Lightning, on top of Bitcoin, and that market is only going to progress and get further and further and further. Then, of course, all the other markets are going to want some of that liquidity that is built into this market. And some of the public mining companies, they went live on the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange. They got some of the largest capital markets, the largest sources of funds in the Middle East that are investing in Bitcoin mining. And if you are also one of the world's most important oil producers and gas producers, then you can take some of that gas. And of course, the play for the Middle East is to use Bitcoin proof of work in order to optimize efficiency, diversify markets, and then build the whole thing on top of Bitcoin, Lightning, stable coins, and various other things, and then put the securities on blockchains and use stable coins in order to bring everything into the market in the center of the universe. And this could be a drain as we are having these fights. For example, the euro dollar is going through a currency war right now, at the same time as the petrodollar going through a currency war right now. But if you can do these on-ramps where you have stable coins, which are essentially full reserve banking, which are competing with fractional reserve banking, and now we're having the adjustments to a country's going to choose central bank digital currencies or stable coins, and they don't compete with Bitcoin because Bitcoin's more on the savings side of the market, but you can build on top of this technology. I see an amazing play to recollaborate financial markets, disrupt capital markets, leapfrog. And quite frankly, there couldn't be a better location to see that opportunity. And then all the other surrounding nations, if we can move from a movement away from the petrodollar so that the dollar proof of weapons network is not weaponizing violence and destruction, and the model of America becoming a regional power and therefore exiting the region, if we can move, and we'll cover more in the geopolitical section, how we get there, to an environment more centered around peace, and we can now have these capital inflows, and you can have dollar stable coins and Bitcoin as savings, this transition that we're all going through could be a real net positive for the world. It's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch. Some jurisdictions will try to centralize it. Others will look to do it in a decentralized way. And we will make sure that we are covering that whole transition together. But I do believe that this is a strategic play to leapfrog capital markets and use stable coins to reverse the dollar milkshake theory and the dollar proof of weapons network that has caused so much violence, destruction globally through all these covert wars that are trying to get the world addicted to dollars through the International Monetary Fund and that network that it was created around the Bank for International Settlements, the International Monetary Fund, the Federal Reserve, the network of central banks that were created from the Bank of England. So this is another tool. We've now got Bitcoin, we got stable coins, and now we're getting into capital markets. We envisioned this a long time ago. Way back in 2012, we were all, when Bitcoin was 3 years into its experiment, we were playing around with colored coins, and then we launched the first stable coins in around 2014. And then we were looking at how stock markets can be disrupted. Lightning Network didn't exist. So then you had things that would just spam the network. But now we're at a time when the technology is really getting to that place where all of this can happen as well. The requirement for it really to have that, that frictionless flow is a tax neutral environment, which is why I think investing $2 billion in Binance, and if this is a play, not just to list Binance on a legacy stock exchange, but actually fulfill the vision of using, tokenized assets. I think this with that level of 260 million users, this could solve simultaneously the tax neutrality with the regulatory environment to make this possible, with the liquidity and traction. And so that is what I believe we are seeing right now. And I think that's why we had a bit of FUD from Wall Street Journal, but a bit of a defensive play where suddenly, the Abu Dhabi exchange and the US side were thinking, well, hold on, America wants to be crypto capital of the world. And so, there was a bit of a defensive play in order to see if the Trump administration could invest in the Binance US branch, which is interesting because if you remember when we covered the Binance story, it was in those stablecoin rails between Binance US and Binance International that was one of the tools that was weaponized in order to get that controlled that hostile takeover by the US government of Binance. It's interesting that those rails are where we're going next. And now we're under a new administration in the US, and we're going to have the stablecoin regulations based upon everything we've been covering in the US. So anyway, I do believe, and this is speculation, they haven't confirmed anything, but this is a play at leapfrogging capital markets into tokenized exchanges. And I do think that this is going to be a multi-blockchain world. And I do think the blockchain, race or arms race, as we can call it, I do think that the scalability and privacy enhancements of Lightning built on top of Bitcoin, even though there may be a few different journeys along that way and it may be multi-chain, I think it's going to be a really important move. And that's why it's good timing that we're starting to get the first round of stable coins on top of Lightning. Anyway, I think this is a massive play for the future of capital markets. It really wasn't priced in at the moment, and it's really just an indication of how much further we have to go. We got peer-to-peer fiat rails where people are able to connect together and be able to go through the legacy system in order to offboard onto these stablecoin rails as well. And obviously the energy arms race of those that are utilizing Bitcoin proof of work to have a very efficient way of mining those last Bitcoins. We've got another over 100 years of mining, but there's only another 1 million left. And as the market cap goes up and up and up, we're seeing that the hash rate is going up and up and up, which means that we're getting more and more secure. And so if we ever have these big corrections that lead to some miners being unprofitable, we get the difficulty rate adjustment. And then that makes some miners unprofitable, others are profitable. And the whole system has just been designed in this beautiful, apolitical, geopolitically neutral. And the fact that we're getting these Middle Eastern plays, as well as, there was an element of a lot of the industry originally was in China. They made some bad moves. Some of that industry then went to America. And obviously, we're seeing many of the Brics nations, and we'll cover more of those announcements. And we're getting this really nice balance and especially as if the US dollar proof of weapons network is now going to, we'll cover this more in the macro section, going through a weakening of the dollar in order to rebuild its manufacturing base, so that it can, actually be more of an exporter and an internal manufacturing base. Then we could see much of those capital markets redistribute away from what's called the dollar milkshake theory, where everything's being sucked up and countries can no longer invest in their own countries. But if this could be a recollaboration where not everything is lent to the US government and then it's weaponized through the US dollar proof of weapons network, this is perfect currency mechanisms and capital market mechanisms in order to get an environment that could wave in, I guess we could call it, the next fourth turning. So this is a very important thing. It is an energy arms race, which is why we're seeing so much of changes in the market in order to make sure that the energy flows, the natural gas flows, the oil flows, the Belt and Road initiatives, the regional side of America now. What is the role of the European Union? We'll cover all of this in the macro section. But Bitcoin is really having an impact in these different areas, as whether people know it or not, the Bitcoin is the perfect solution to sit in the middle and create an element of harmony where Bitcoin is the regulator of the regulator for these fiat currency rails. As we transition to this world of artificial intelligence, where I believe governments won't be able to collect tax or regulate, so we're going to be using technology in order to regulate as these borders break down in this technocratic world that we're kind of moving into. So Bitcoin mining would certainly be a play that they would be doing it. And even though America has announced their Bitcoin strategic reserve, I think it would be very dumb and naive not to think that various regions in the Middle East have been accumulating their Bitcoin strategic reserves. And there is a reason why the price is down, because after America announced their Bitcoin strategic reserve, those that are the controllers of capital markets can do some short-term manipulation in order to oppress the price for a little bit longer so that nation states can accumulate the Bitcoin they need in order to be relevant in this new arms race. And of course, you should be taking advantage of that. Own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. We cover the rules every time. I try to remind you, and sit back and enjoy it, because the lower the price goes, the more Bitcoin you get to buy for your fiat currency in this digital scarcity fixed supply asset that is recollaborating all those markets around the world. So there was a bit of a rumor, and this may have been FUD. It may have been bad journalism, or it may have been an element of truth. But immediately after at the same time as the Abu Dhabi $2 billion announcement, Trump's family, the Wall Street Journal said that they're in talks to acquire a stake in Binance US. This is, basically Trump's family have been positioning themselves in order to profit from what I consider to be the asset stripping and corporate raiding of the proof of weapons network as it transitions to this new world of stable coins and Bitcoin strategic reserves in order to have the tools it needs to take out the Federal Reserve proof of weapons network, or at least compete with it. And at the same time, transitioning to who are going to be the stable coin issuers when this, the banking system and the shareholders of the Federal Reserve decide that they need to adjust to this, and we get this deleveraging moment, and many of the things that are happening that we're watching in real time right now. So anyway, of course, Trump is launching his own NFT collections, launching DeFi platforms on top of Ethereum, launching stable coins that he said are going to be backed by US treasuries, launching meme coins for himself and his wife, launching Bitcoin ETFs, launching social networks. They're going to be connected with NFT marketplaces and everything, because, quite frankly, Trump is using the fact that he is being paid by his lobby groups to transition all of America's assets over to this transition of the technocracy. He wants to make sure that his family gets a stake in it, as it were. And so now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But CZ, the founder or the ex-founder, the ex-CEO that is still the major shareholder in Binance, this hostile saga continues. But he said he refuted the claim and said that the Trump administration, is not, may not be involved in that. But at the same time, there was hints that CZ is trying to get a presidential pardon to take away the problem of that 4-month sentence that he saw. So with the Trump administration and America, we've always said, in order to understand what comes next, don't listen to a word the politicians say, follow the money, and you can get yourself ahead of everything. Right, so what else is happening in the US dollar proof of weapons network during this transition? Well, the Utah Senate didn't do a Bitcoin strategic reserve for its state. Bad mistake. They'll pivot, come back later. But the first states that actually do this are going to be the ones that benefit from being able to protect themselves from the potential dismantling of the US dollar proof of weapons network. And of course, shout out to Thomas Massie, who got a lot of attacks this week. Thomas Massie, always sticking to his principles and exposing various elements of the proof of weapons network, like the AIPAC influence of the Israeli lobby that bribes all the politicians in order to be a vital part of propping up the petrodollar through destabilizing regions. He's always done a lot to expose that politicians and Congress members are essentially fake democracies because they're bought for by the military industrial complex, the banking lobby, the proof of weapons network, big pharma, the Israeli lobby, and the important lobbies that are able to exert influence over this proof of weapons network. Well, anyway, when that happens, Utah does not have a Bitcoin strategic reserve yet, but it did launch a Bitcoin bill, and it passed. And this is to safeguard the right to self-custody, which is hugely important, and to safeguard the Bitcoin mining industry. So this means that the state can engage in Bitcoin mining, individuals can engage in Bitcoin mining, and if your state does not protect you, you can at least self-custody Bitcoin, because you got to take care of yourself first before you start taking care of your communities, countries, and other parts of the world as well. So that is very good things to see. We also started to see this controlled demolition of the corrupt Fed-installed SEC chair Gary Gensler, now that he is gone, and he was implementing a Fed-first policy for companies like BlackRock to try and take the industry, our industry, and hand it over to the globalist large controllers of financial assets like BlackRock. There was Operation Choke Point 2.0, where the Federal Reserve and the SEC engaged in rampant corruption with agents like SBF that was implanted in our industry for FTX, and Alex Majinsky, that was implanted into Celsius. Basically these that recollaboration, as it were, to take over the industry, approve the Bitcoin ETFs, as we've always covered. Well, now the new SEC, which is not, I believe, working for a Fed-first policy. Instead, it is working for a technocrat-first policy. So we have exchanged, corruption from the Fed proof of weapons network to corruption from artificial intelligence generated stable coins and other rails, which is what Trump is delivering, the asset stripping from one form of corruption to another form of corruption, but keeping the model the same, which we'll cover more in the macro section. But the US SEC has stated that no longer requires crypto companies to register as trading systems. So this is going through a deregulation environment at the same time as defining what the regulations are going to look like, so that the industry can prevail and move to the next stage. The Senator Lummis, Cynthia Lummis, who's been working on the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve, she actually reintroduced the bill, and there's now a 2025 version of the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Bill. It's called the Bitcoin Act, and now it has been adjusted slightly, maybe for political feedback or whatever it needs to do, but it's now got stronger backing after the 2024 version. And it was, kind of stalled with the committee before that. So it's come back for the 2025 version. And the bill now basically mandates that there would need to be a fixed 200,000 Bitcoin annual purchase by the Treasury. Now, it's important that it's the Treasury and not the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve will strengthen the proof of work network debt-based Ponzi scheme. Whereas the Treasury are able to have a vital tool in case it needs to change and have a monetary reform, which it needs to do if it wants to actually transition to an environment of sustainability rather than this multi-decade unnatural 1913 Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme that transitioned America into $36 trillion of debt and $250 trillion of commitments, all for the profits of the banks that are the owners and controllers of those globalist financial rails that have no America First agenda and would just simply dump the dollar as soon as it's no longer useful, and just transition the world to the next world order where they can take the capital away from there over to another country. And set the rails in place as Bitcoin resists against it. And now they could not beat us, so they had to join us. So the bill anyway says that the US government would need to purchase 200,000 Bitcoin. And the important part is that we have our ability to self-custody, so that as governments try to, gobble up some of that Bitcoin, take it out of the market in order to work on their national security arms races, so that they've got tools that can be used as their currencies become less and less relevant or refinance or go through changes. They have their bill there anyway. Now, the most important part about this is people will say, oh, yeah, everyone wants governments to buy Bitcoin. No, that's not the point here. The governments don't need to buy Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not need governments. In fact, it's a natural thing that when you create a scarce asset that goes through this 4-year cycle that we have experienced throughout Bitcoin's entire history, and it is digital scarcity that's providing the ability for people to exit the fiat currency rails and beat the inflation that is created by the proof of weapons network without having to go into debt slavery. Naturally, everyone will want some of that. And so I'd love for it to be just for individuals, but Bitcoin doesn't care. So governments can buy it, corporations can buy it, individuals can buy it, even central banks can buy it if they want to. That is the nature of a free market. But the point is, Bitcoin doesn't need those people. They need Bitcoin. And that is the game theory that is playing out right in front of us. The new bill has kind of some stickier rules around not being able to sell and make sure it is a hodl position. So now that we've got those announcements and America's going through its Bitcoin Strategic Reserve strategy, we had the reaction from other countries. I've already covered the Abu Dhabi capital markets. I don't believe they want to announce strategic reserves because they'd rather accumulate more. But we did have an announcement and several announcements from those that are, weaponized by the financial weapons of mass destruction, like sanctions, which is leading to this de-dollarization at the moment, because covert wars are being fought, where you have these weapons cells, multinational organizations like NATO, which are there in order to create the fear of war through intelligence agencies, so that whenever the Fed prints money, it can go into the hands of where the lobby groups have done it. They can wipe out the middle class America, make sure that the corporations that are bribing the politicians get the money that's printed. That creates inflation, and it benefits those that are able to get closer to borrowing at 0% from the proof of weapons network, or directly get investment from the government into those organizations. You get, you got this kind of weaponization of the dollar. That's why it's a proof of weapons network, because it really recollaborates based upon how much is spent on weapons and violence. And so, what we're seeing with NATO right now is that NATO was used in order to use organizations like the CIA to expand NATO into jurisdictions, interrogate wars, so that there is retaliations. And that is what we have seen with the Russia-Ukraine situation. And so in retaliation to that, the Bank of Russia, the Central Bank of Russia, has decided to allow limited crypto purchases for investors through their proof of weapons network. And Russia is a full-blown military industrial complex. But the difference is that America privatizes. So you have crony capitalism, its weapons industry, its oil industry, and they have more authoritarian regimes, but that makes them more efficient in terms of not having to mess around too much with politics. Both models are awful, but you have these two different models that work side by side. One is controlled by billionaires corrupting the system with fake democracies, where there's all this distraction with left and right, inflation that wipes out the middle class, and then all of the assets are stripped over to those that are the most corrupt. Whereas you have a proof of weapons network like Russia, where you have more authoritarianism, but you don't have the pretense of democracy. You have a slightly different model, and everyone knows what they get. And there's a benefit to it. They pay less tax because resources are used for state. And then you have these semi-capitalism models. Now, the unnatural models like the Soviet Union and the disaster of communism has fallen. Once the proof of weapons network made all their money out of communism, the ideology has fallen. But it was all about redistributing wealth to those that benefit from it. And so Russia is now they made a second announcement. So they're allowing their financial institutions in order to make limited purchases into that. And at the same time, there was a confirmation from Reuters that Russia is using both Bitcoin, Ethereum, and stablecoins for oil transactions with both China and India. And that is really interesting, because here is the hypocrisy, right? We know that the dollar proof of weapons network was used in order to, confiscate and sanction a bunch of money, destroy economies, use NATO in order to expand wars, and then use their control over media to make it look like America's, exporting democracy, when the reality is they're sacrificing regions like Europe and killing Ukrainians in order to prop up the profits of the military industrial complex. But at the same time, the hypocrisy of it is everyone sanctions and that they confiscate money. So the European Union and America confiscated 350 billion from the central bank. And then they use sanctions to weaken the economy. But what actually happened? In the end, the natural gas that was going from Russia to Germany, the CIA blew up the pipeline, made it where you have to buy, 100% more expensive natural gas from America. That destroyed Europe, weakened Europe, created a dependency upon America, which is completely being weakened right now and is in a dire recession. And as a result of that, Russia just simply took its oil and gas, and sold it to India. And then India started strengthening the Brics corridor by clipping the cheap gas that it was getting from Russia and then exporting it and selling it to Europe. So Europe just ended up getting sacrificed. It doesn't, the flows don't change. You just end up using these currency wars in order to destroy economies and kill people. And that's the nature of propping up these debt-based Ponzi schemes that central banks created in order to get governments deeper and deeper into debt to fund their wars. But anyway, so now they've been using stablecoins, Bitcoin and Ethereum to trade with each other to facilitate these transactions. And that is creating the type of adoption for when they launch their currency. They can also, at Brics, go through the leapfrog. And if everyone is building in the global south their Bitcoin strategic reserves, then they get to have the system that could be solve the problem of their gold-backed currency that they're said that they're aiming to launch at some point. Not sure if they are. They didn't say it was a strategic goal. They were going to be working on using plugging these rails together in order to do barter trades using blockchains to facilitate such transactions. But they were able to, go through these different new rails, and that took away the power of SWIFT, which is what a vital part and tool of the US dollar proof of weapons network. And so this was the recognition that Russia won the financial war, the covert war that was being fought, and we're seeing right now the military war as US retreats and starts to change the model that we're experiencing, and we'll cover more in the geopolitical section. We've got the Middle East energy play, capital markets play. We've got the Brics corridor building probably strategic reserves and embracing the industry more. As we know, they're probably mining it at the sovereign level. We've got the America being able to protect itself from the Fed using these tools and Bitcoin strategic reserves. And all of that is connecting the rails together. And what is Europe doing? Well, the European Union announced that, of course, there was a hostile takeover of Europe and all the European members by the European Central Bank. That was the end of, the project of the Cold War, was to take away the currencies of all of those countries and consolidate them under one power structure so that you can have these dictators. The petrodollar was making sure democracy never happens in countries like the Middle East because they want to negotiate with dictators. In the euro-dollar market, they just said, take all these countries and package them up into one central bank called the European Central Bank. And then those petrodollars and eurodollars can be used in order to get more violence, death, and destruction to a Fed-first policy, so that they can get the world addicted to dollars and use war and violence in order to get there. And so the European Central Bank, of course, is going down. We've been sacrificed. We've wiped out the Europeans. We've put Europe into recession. America blew up Nord Stream pipeline. NATO, managed to get Europe into war, weaken all those economies, strip those economies away, install corrupt politicians that are Fed first policies, ECB first policies. And now we've got peak record centralization where our partners in the Middle East can essentially, through OPEC Plus, determine whether there's inflation or not. And we can use this network of central banks to asset strip all of the people of all of their wealth in order to, prop up this proof of weapons, fiat currency, debt-based Ponzi scheme. And we need an experiment. We need a sucker. We need a region that doesn't have sovereignty and is full of leaders that are not acting in the interest of the European people. We're talking to you, Keir Starmer in the UK. We're talking to all of the puppet governments across the European Union. The European Central Bank has said by October 2025, the ECB will launch its digital euro, its central bank digital currency, which is the final part of the puzzle in destroying Germany, World War I, World War II, in installing the Soviet Union in Russia, in funding through the Federal Reserve and taking capitalism and indebting the US government, in dismantling the UK government when the Bank of England took over and used World War I in order to recollaborate the world, handing over parts of Palestine to install the CIA, the MI6 and CIA into through Israel into the Middle East, create violence across the whole region, corrupt, take over all of the, corrupt the leaders and the monarchs, don't allow democracy to prevail, and complete the hostile takeover of the European Union as well, and install a ECB, all connected through Switzerland and the Bank for International Settlements. And this is really the end of the project, the hostile takeover of install the European Union, install the European Central Bank, and then get a full central bank digital currency to complete the complete takeover, where they can now programmatically say, you must spend money in this direction, program negative interest rates in, programmatically state that if you don't get this vaccine, then we can say you will be punished financially, or whatever policy they want. They can use Europe in order to exert it. And what is needed in order to get through that mission? Well, firstly, you need to take the proof of weapons network, the war machine, and you need to move it over from America through NATO into the European Union. And so now the European Union is saying Putin is Hitler and playing this theatrics in order to say, right, we need $800 billion so that we can inject it into the German proof of weapons network, the military industrial complex, UK military industrial complex, France military industrial complex. And of course, we need to make sure that all that money goes back into the American military industrial complex through Palantir, who is building AI, artificial intelligence, and is using that to plug into drones, F-35 fighter jets that it's selling all around the world, and beta testing genocide and occupation as a service in Gaza right now in order to be able to sell those artificial intelligence to governments all around the world, and make sure that America gets all those data centers, all of that energy, and make sure that it wins the AI race against China, with Abu Dhabi probably making a play in the middle in top of these capital markets and dismantling the petrodollar, dismantling the euro dollar, but making Europe the new war machine in order to print money, get that money, and sacrifice Europeans that don't know what is coming from them, and they're just choosing between eating and heating, wondering why is everybody getting wealthy and I'm trying to just live to pay the debt of the banks that benefited and created this whole system in the first place. And so that's the transition, the other side that we are seeing. What did they have to say in order to create this theatrics? After that theatrics with Zelensky that led to this transition, that led to the money printing, that led to NATO expansion, that said every country asset strip your economies further and spend 5% on military. And a chunk of that will go to America. Well, of course, the EU come out and say, well, Trump's support for the crypto industry could undermine Europe's monetary sovereignty and financial stability. This is exactly what we had after World War I, when this network was created in the first place. You had the installation of the Federal Reserve to make people think that fake crony capitalism in America was actual capitalism, and then use the Bolshevik Revolution in order to create communism. And you had the uprising, which replaced Russia with the Soviet Union. And then you fund both sides of that mechanism, which is what the Bank of England and its network did from there. Use war. And now we're doing the same thing. We're saying, America, you can be a stablecoin technocracy, while Europe, you can be a central bank digital currency. And we can use and get people to spend more on death, destruction, and violence by having this fake cold proxy war between America and Europe. And we can use energy from both the Middle East, Russia, in order to create this forever war type of environment. But there was a resistance against it. And that was the Brics corridor. They did not plan that China would become a superpower and then align with Iran, India, and Russia and the global south. And then China started investing through the Belt and Road Initiative in building up the economies that were destroyed by the International Monetary Fund covert regime change, the CIA, Mossad, and MI6. They didn't plan for that. And in 2008, we had Bitcoin's proof of work, which then created a bottom-up resistance movement to fight the control of the central banking system. And now we get to opt out. Now we get to boycott and hold Bitcoin in self-custody and say F you to the proof of weapons network. You guys do what you need to do, and eventually you will need us. And you know what? That AI, those social network control mechanisms, those data plays, those big data plays, those energy plays, that energy is going to be plugged into peaceful Bitcoin proof of work. And eventually artificial intelligence will be decentralized, open source, and just like Bitcoin, create a resistance. And those social networks, that data will be peer-to-peer, where you can transport it for you by putting it on decentralized and open source networks like Bitcoin, so that when that AI comes through, when China says we want to control this part of the world, and when America says we want to control the world, and the globalists, which control both networks, they say we want to control the world through this corruption, we can have this resistance against it, thanks to Satoshi Nakamoto and game theory and riba-free, interest-free money that we were always taught was the root cause of all the problems. If you go back to the theology, if you go back to the pre-central banking, scholarly studies of economics before we were told this one version of capitalism and communism and socialism, it always predicted that interest and usury would be the destruction that we are witnessing today. And so we created an antithesis to it with Bitcoin. And so now the different banks and financial institutions are saying, well, we need to hedge. And so Spain's largest second largest bank, BBVA, decided that it is going to approve and offer Bitcoin and Ethereum trading and try and earn its fees. It couldn't beat us, so they joined us. It doesn't matter. Fortunately, proof of work was designed where it doesn't matter who owns it. And that was one of the key distinctions between proof of stake and proof of work. Proof of stake, the more those people own, the more they control the network. Proof of work, it doesn't matter who owns it. And you can hold it in self-custody in order to have this two-tiered system that they may try and control half of it. But fortunately, the vast majority of Bitcoin is held in self-custody as well. And we had Thailand's SEC and regulators came out and now officially approved Tether's USDT as a compliant cryptocurrency. So we're seeing this movement towards stablecoin regulations. And also Japan came out and announced that they are cutting tax on Bitcoin from its 55% down to 20%. So treating Bitcoins differently to other assets as part of its broad cryptocurrency reform strategy. Now, Japan was always big in this industry. We had the first crazy exchanges like Mt. Gox in Japan, some of the biggest hacks of centralized exchanges like CoinCheck. And it really was ahead of the curve in terms of Bitcoin acceptance as well. But now it's starting to recognize that. But, the Bank of Japan is just one of the vital tools in allowing this speculative economy based upon free money from the Bank of Japan. And it was a mechanism of control after the New World Order was set up in the post-World War II era. But Japan is announcing that. On the corporate side, it looks like Microstrategy, which is now called Strategy, which I've already started to speculate, I believe is a tool of the US government at this stage in order to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible, so that if America ever wanted to nationalize strategy, because it was too unnatural the way Michael Saylor came through, just like SBF was a very unnatural, came out of nowhere and was perpetuated across all the platforms and went from 0 Bitcoin in strategy to 500,000 Bitcoin in strategy, more than the Chinese government, more than the US government, more than the UK government, the Kingdom of Bhutan, El Salvador, Ukraine, all of them combined. Strategy ended up owning, approximately 500,000 Bitcoin. Now it announced that it is going to be raising $21 billion of perpetual preferred stock as we asset strip the legacy stock markets in order to hack the system, buy Bitcoin, and then it can create this essentially strategic reserve in case America wants to nationalize, give you a central bank digital currency, or print a stable coin in exchange for those shares so that it could build its strategic stockpiles or reserves in an emergency scenario. And Michael Saylor was at the White House meeting and transitioned from a Bitcoin only to kind of a digital asset type of narrative based upon my belief that he is now an asset for intelligence and the US government or the proof of weapons network. Anyway. Now we shall see whether in this harder market, because there is a lot of stress. We'll cover this in the macro section. As America is being asset stripped by the Trump administration for the technocrats, the market's getting harder. So we'll see. Is he able to raise that 21 billion? We'll see whether that is an effective strategy that still goes through into an oppressive market. And it kind of depends upon whether we have a breakaway of Bitcoin from the stock market, which would probably happen under an environment of stagflation, or does Bitcoin correct so that you can buy more and more cheap Bitcoin as it recollaborates to more of a global play rather than being dependent upon the US dollar proof of weapons network. And therefore, it would be in line with the market. It kind of depends on several moves. And we don't really, it's hard to predict the market because we don't have markets. We have peak centralization. You're just dealing with government, central banks, and oil producers that are sitting around in meetings and deciding where the markets go. These are the global controllers of finance. They're using jurisdictions and they're deciding what will happen. So we don't need to pretend they're free markets. It is the whims of what happens when they meet in Saudi Arabia, when they meet in these different jurisdictions and decide what they're going to be doing. So the OCC, there was an announcement, which is the Office of Currency Commission, I believe, which is the regulator that sits under the Federal Reserve for the larger banks. They are now allowing the banks to custody crypto. This is the Office of the Controller of Currency. Interesting name, right? This is different to the smaller banks, which can be hostile taken over, like FDIC, which is essentially an asset stripping organization that pretends like, they'll say, right, we'll guarantee $250,000 of bank deposits. But it just means they can take the smaller banks when the Federal Reserve manipulates rates in the economy for its larger bank shareholders that are in the OCC network. The FDIC banks can just be hostile taken over. They can be gobbled up. And there is a, crony capitalism in order to facilitate that. We saw that in 2022 when Operation Choke Point 2.0 was used in order to use a pump and dump scheme and oil prices negotiated between OPEC Plus and the Federal Reserve and the Biden administration. That was used in order to wipe out a chunk of the banks. And the two agents of that network were Peter Thiel, that told everyone to withdraw from Silicon Valley Bank, and Bill Ackman, that lobbied in order to get FDIC and the Fed and the taxpayer to underwrite the banking system so that they could asset strip it, take over the banks for free. But they created a new tool, and said, we'll wipe out the 3 crypto-friendly banks, Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate, and Signature. And that's an example of how FDIC is just a mechanism for asset stripping under the pretense of guaranteeing the system in a debt-based Ponzi scheme where there is more debt than money. And so therefore you inevitably have these events like long-term capital management, or the dot-com boom and bust, or the global financial crisis, and these different ones. So that is different from the FDIC banks. The FDIC banks were already able to custody crypto, but they made the rules where they have to end up with, if the price goes up, they end up with more assets. And so now we've got change in those rules, but now the OCC banks, the large ones, can also engage in the market. And a few more trends that we need to watch out for in the Bitcoin section is the connection between, now that many of the Bitcoin mining companies are also using their machine and their data centers in order to provide compute for artificial intelligence, we need to make sure that we're watching the big compute, the big data, and the artificial intelligence sector in its intersection as America and China try to control it. Middle East invests in both regions, and Bitcoin is providing the bottom-up decentralized movement. But we had a few movements in that China announced this essentially its next DeepSeek moment, where it unveiled, what's it called? Zukonji 3, which is a 105 qubit quantum computer that allegedly is 1 million times faster than the quantum computer that Google has released. So we're getting these real weapons being fired out there. And Bitcoin will have to, which is a global side, quantum resistant cryptography is something that eventually our market will need to adjust to. And that may be the next type of internal Bitcoin war as we figure out at what point to make that transition. And so we've seen this before, and we know that Bitcoin can adjust to it, and we know that the technology will exist. But anyway, China is starting to engage in these quantum computer wars with the American companies, and showing that that they are playing that race, and not only having the narrative of they're just copying us, but actually they're innovating several times higher as well. This is why America needs to focus and win that race, and that is the race that will determine, I guess, the next phase of artificial intelligence. They also released a new AI agent called Mahus, and it is meant to be basically a lot more accurate than DeepSeek, and it can handle basically, it did a demo where it can handle finance, research, and more, and different types of activities, all autonomously and at the same time simultaneously. So this is the AI race that I think is requiring this transition from the petrodollar, eurodollar, and the violence of the proof of weapons network into America focusing and being a regional power as well. We had a little bit of narrative around as well. I just want to make sure, because it's important to recognize that the macro, geopolitical, and Bitcoin are all kind of combining into one important thing. But Trump put out a lot more narrative. We've covered this in previous broadcasts around why countries like Greenland need to be building their Bitcoin strategic reserves as a national security in a global arms race in order to have more leverage and negotiation power and more sovereignty. But Trump is recognizing that it started to put out offers to the people of Greenland as basically narratives around a way out of their European rule, a way out of Danish, the colonizers, come join the American colonizers. He was given some narrative around how, Denmark has been ruling Greenland with an iron fist since World War II, which is true. That was the proof of weapons network in the post-World War II order, where the Bretton Woods system was designed in order to take all of the gold from colonization, all of the gold from the Soviet Union and transfer it over to America, while everyone has their currencies tradable against the dollar, and with a promise that it would be backed by all that gold that was stolen from via the British Empire over to the American Empire. And then they defaulted on that agreement in 71 in order to fight the Vietnamese War, in order to tell everybody that we need that money for peace, of course, as they escalate those networks as well. Anyway, he's putting out a narrative there that it is time for Greenland to rejoin North America under the protection of the US dollar proof of weapons network. As I said, the reason this becomes important, as in previous broadcasts I've covered, is that if Greenland wants to actually increase its strength and independence, then it should be leveraging these natural resources in order to repurpose them with partnerships, but use that in order to build their own Bitcoin strategic reserves and become a small player in the arms race through partnership, in order to build more of its sovereignty. And it can sit between Europe and America and become an important player as well, or it can just be colonized from the European colonizers to the American local regional power colonization as well. I don't really take that seriously, but I do think it will be all part of that painting EU as a war machine, while painting America, which is the beneficiary of all this, into the propagators of peace. That's how this whole network is built together. But anyway, they could be using, it's too late now at this stage, but you should still be starting. Build your Bitcoin strategic reserves. It becomes an important part of David beating Goliath. And you can even pay your local people dividends in Bitcoin. We did this at Bank to the Future in 2014, where we built repurposing of Iceland energy to build out a data center for proof of work Bitcoin mining, which was powered by local volcano power. And we used the cold environment in order to use geothermal cooling of the rigs. And then we launched a Bitcoin bond, which was paying out daily dividends to anyone that was building their retirement plan through Bank to the Future. And we're starting to now get a lot of narrative around bit bonds, where people can build products like what Strategy is using. You could offer, say, low interest bonds with a profit share on the growth of Bitcoin. I think this is going to become a really important play for countries as we move into, Abu Dhabi potentially being the center of global capital markets. And everyone has the opportunity to be a part of that. This really is a David beat Goliath moment as we watch El Salvador and their strategy persist. Anyway, once you've got Bitcoin strategic reserves, you can issue your own stable coins, and you can do that based upon the reserves, and play the structure as the game theory planes itself. And over time, you could be building your sovereign wealth fund as well, based upon and Greenland can become a David beat Goliath type of power. It can use it for its security and its independence, and it can make sure that it self-sustains itself without having to go into debt slavery, take International Monetary Fund money, which is the mechanisms for being colonized by either the British Empire, Chinese Empire, or American empires as well. And so this is the beauty. Singapore kind of proved it, that type of model, where it built sovereign wealth in order to make all of its citizens almost like shareholders in its economy, so they never have uprisings because they feel like they are a shareholder in their own economy. And it, use that wealth in order to make sure everyone owned their own property. And rather than creating this, debt-based Ponzi scheme where all of the assets are stripped, you work on making it a joint mission. And Singapore's the perfect example of becoming a powerhouse. And now that opportunity is open to all sovereign nations. And here's the beauty of the whole thing. None of them have to do it. They can carry on. It will take them to World War III, or they can utilize Bitcoin proof of work in order to go to an environment of peace. But we can build our own financial independence through self-custody, through beating the inflation of the proof of weapons network by having a decent strategy. For those that want to build a strategy just like this, head over to simondixon.com. Later this year, every halving cycle, I release showing you exactly how I do it. For anyone who wants to do it, I'll be releasing a free video series. Just make sure you're on the mailing list to simondixon.com. Get your free membership to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. And we're going to transition over to the second section, which is this week in macro. What I also need from you is a favor. Wherever you